Virtual reality is an amazing piece of technology with a lot of really great applications, one of the more popular of them being video games. So in this video I'm going to show you guys how to set up an Unreal Engine project so that way you can get up and moving in a virtual reality game. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So first thing I want to start with is creating the project. So I've already gone over, creating a project in video a couple weeks back. But there was something I wanted to know about creating a virtual reality template. So if you go ahead, you will actually see that there's a virtual reality template. You don't necessarily need to use this. It's certainly possible to create a full virtual reality player from scratch, but I find this to be just a little bit simpler. It gives you a little bit of something to work with. But what I wanted to know was if you go over here where it says choose whether to create a Blueprint or C++ project, there is no C++. It's certainly possible to create a player in C++, and I will go over that. But for whatever reason, the people at Epic Games do not supply you with a C++ template. Your only option is Blueprint. So we're going to go ahead and create one. Another thing I want to note is before you create your project and before you ever open it, if you ever close it, close it for the day and reopen it the next day, make sure you have your VR headset plugged in and it is actually set up with your computer correctly. I'm using an Oculus Quest and I actually have it hooked up through Oculus Link. I don't know if any wireless options work well. I've also used Rift S's, so make sure that the little light that you have on the Rift S is white and not orange or anything. Make sure it's properly hooked up. I've never used any Vive, so I can't say for sure how that works. But if you don't do this, then you'll actually get a grayed out VR preview section when you go ahead and open it up, and I'll show you where that is here in a second as well. So I'm going to go ahead and name my project. We'll go and call it VR Movement, which already exists. We'll call it VR Player. There we go. We'll go and create the project. This will of course take a sec, so I'm just going to go and let this do its thing. Alright, so once we have the project open, you'll actually see up here in play. This was something I went over in my video a couple weeks back, but you'll actually see that there's a VR preview right here. If you don't have your headset hooked up correctly, the VR preview will actually be grayed out. If this happens, just close the project, hook up your headset, make sure it's properly hooked up, and then reopen the project, and you should be able to click on VR preview without a problem. So I want to show you real quick. So if we go ahead and actually run in VR preview, you can actually see with the template map that they actually give us, you can actually see that I can fully move around, I can do all that. One thing that's not hooked up is the hands. The reason is that the default template does not actually have a player hooked up in it. It shows you some of the basics of how, virtual reality, how the setups are. But these aren't actually hooked up. So what I like to do is I actually like to create a new level. The reason being is I don't like this one. It feels a little bit too small for me. So I'm actually going to go ahead and file new level and then just go ahead and do a VR basic. You don't have to do this. If you want, you can use the default level and just use that. I just prefer, I think it's a little bit easier to create a new level. Once you have this level open, next thing we're going to want to do is I'm actually going to get rid of this just because I'm going to be building it for single player. We don't need to worry about that. You can use that, but it's more for multiplayer use, really. Or if you're going to be changing around what character you're spawning. I'm not going to bother with that. So if we go ahead and jump in, let's see, virtual reality blueprints. What we want right here is the motion controller pawn. So if we go and drag this in, this will be our player for VR. We're actually going to want to go over here real quick as well. Set up to auto receive input from player 0. And where's the, I passed it. Auto possess player 0. This will just automatically make it so that way the first player, or in this case the only player, will automatically be assigned to this pawn. So now if we go ahead and press play. Oh, there we go. We can actually see that we're able to move around, and there's my hands. So we're actually able to move around our hands. They should have some of the functionality in. Yes, they do. So that would usually be teleport, which does require a little bit more configuring. I'm not going to go into movement and everything. I'm going to do that in another video. But you can actually see that some of the basic functionality that you need is built in there, which is pretty cool. So if we go ahead and escape here, so I wanted to go over real quick how the Blueprint player is set up initially. So I'm actually going to open up a couple things. So I'm actually going to open up the motion controller pawn, and also the BP motion controller. So the reason I'm opening up both, that was the wrong thing. The reason I'm opening up both is these are both different parts of the same player. And I'll go show you what I mean right here. So when we go and we begin play, which is once we start the game, you can actually see that it does two things. So if we follow up here, if you're running an Oculus or Steam VR, which should be hooked up to Vive if I recall, those are both set to start tracking at floor level. PSVR, for whatever reason, starts at eye level. I've never used a PlayStation VR headset, so I don't know what the reasoning is there. But essentially, that's how it works. So you can actually see that that's how all of this is hooked up. Essentially, we just need to show where the tracking origin is. You can set it to eye level. The weird thing about that, though, is that if you set tracking origin at eye level, it will be wherever the headset is when you start. That's where the origin point is. So you'll actually be in the floor right there. If you set it at floor level, it will actually still register the floor at the appropriate point, and it'll move your headset up based off of where the floor is when you set up your headset. So that's how that works. Down here is where we actually get into the motion controller. So if we actually look, the VR player is split into three parts. You have your main part, which hooks up with your headset, and it also handles your movement. Then you have each of your hands are separate actors that are actually attached to your main pawn. So they're all separate, but they're all connected still, if that makes sense. So if we actually go through, you can actually see, if we follow the left hand right here, you can actually see it gets set up. The left controller is stored for later use, and then it is actually attached to the main pawn, and then the hands are still separate. Then we have all this other stuff for teleportation, controller input. As I said, I'm not going to go through all that stuff in this video. That'll be for a future video, but that is all here if you would like to look at it, at the time this video comes out. Next, I'm going to go and jump into the motion controller. There's not too much here that goes in the actual scripts. You can actually see, yep, okay, I'm in the right spot. So once we begin play, we simply hide the teleportation cylinders, which was and the room scale mesh, which is what you saw for the teleportation. And then this is actually for the left hand. So it's simply one hand, but it's configured for your right hand. So what it does is it inverts it for your left hand. It's pretty simple, not really that difficult. It's just inverting the scale so that way it looks like a left hand and it'll act like a left hand. So yeah. The hands are actually fairly simple. Again, there's a lot more stuff that I'm not going to go into for this video. You have all this stuff. This is for the animation, for the gripping animation, teleportation, all that. If you'd like, you can look through all this stuff. I'm not going to in this video. So next thing I want to do is I want to go through and I want to show you guys how to set up all of this in C++. It's a little bit more of a setup, but in my opinion, I like to work with C++, so doing that makes it a little bit easier. So first thing we're going to want to do is add new, and we're going to do a new C++ class. I'm going to start with the pawn. So this will be called, let's call it player pawn. There we go. And we'll create class. This will take a sec to create the project, create the code and all that. So I'm just gonna go and let it do its thing and be back in a sec. All right, so we have everything set up. All of our code has been added and all that. The C++ class and everything. So I'm gonna go and start with the header file. So there's gonna be actually a couple things we want to create. First thing we're going to want to create is a camera component. We'll want to make this visible anywhere. And class u camera component, if I recall. And we'll go and call it VR camera. So the camera component is actually going to be set up. This is how the headset will actually see what's going on. It's essentially going to be our headset. The other thing I'm going to add is we're also going to make this visible anywhere. Is a root component, or I guess I should say a scene component. But what this is going to be is this is going to be our root for our whole pawn. To be honest, I don't think that this is necessary. I find that it's a lot better to have though, just because it gives you a definite point of where the player is. It's a point that will actually sit down at your feet, or where your feet would be in VR. So that way you have a better idea of where the player's at. You could essentially do this using the VR camera and just casting straight down to get roughly where the player's at. I just find that this is a little bit easier because it also gives you a definite point to move, especially when you're walking, when you're teleporting, and if you end up making it so that way you're moving to a certain point. To me, it just makes it a little bit easier. So we're actually going to go and create these. So let me see. I called it VR camera, right? Create default subobject u camera component. And we'll go and give it a name here. We'll call it just VR camera. Before this, actually, let's go and create the root component. Default subobject. There we go. Use scene component. Root. All right. And I'm actually going to set the default setup. Was it set root component? There it is. Set root component. And we're going to make root our root component. And then this actually isn't necessary, but I'm just going to do it just to be sure that our camera gets set properly. VR camera. Oh, we haven't set up the include. So let's go and set up the include files real quick. There's actually a couple include files that we actually need. So we're actually going to need a couple here. I'm just going to go and set up a whole bunch of them right quick. So first one we're going to need, I don't need 3 of those. So we're going to go ahead and set up camera slash camera component .h. This will be our first one. Next one we're going to need is, I'm going to go and set one up for the scene component. I don't think we need this one, but I'm just going to do it just to be safe, make sure we have everything in properly. And there is one more that we're actually going to need. I'm going to set up here, which actually does require a little bit more setup. I'll go over that in a second. Display function library .h. So it won't actually show up at this point, and I'll go over that in a second, why. And if you actually compile it with this include file, you'll actually get an error, and we'll set that up in a second. So let's go ahead, VR camera, set up attachment, and that's what it is. And we'll go and set up attachment to root. Okay, so next thing we're going to want to do is head mounted display function library. Long title. And we're actually going to want to set the tracking origin, which is what the head-mounted display function library is actually for. So I'm not going to bother setting it up for, Vive or PSVR and all that. I'm just going to worry for now about the Oculus, since that's what I have set up. This will work fine for Vive as well, so quite frankly it doesn't make that much of a difference. But we need EHMD tracking origin, and we're going to be using floor. And you'll actually recognize this from Blueprint. So that's how that works. Now I said that this wasn't going to fully work correctly. The reason why is if we actually go over here into source and vrplayer.buildcs. So you want to open this up, your build.cs file. Every project will have this. So it will have the name of your project and then .build.cs. And we actually want to add another dependency in here. And that dependency is head-mounted display. That's supposed to be a comma, not period. Head-mounted display. And that will allow us to use the head-mounted display function library from the include file. And if you don't add this in, you'll actually run into issues in Unreal Engine when you go to compile. Visual Studios won't tell you anything. Don't fully trust Visual Studios because it will sometimes give you just false errors and things like that. So we're going to go and compile this. I'll show you what all we've done so far does, and be back in a sec. Alright, so everything's compiled. I did run into a slight issue, which, it's nothing major that you would need to change your code or anything, but I felt like it was something I should bring up in case you haven't ran into these kind of issues with Unreal Engine before. When I compiled it, Unreal Engine didn't automatically update the player pawn. So if I go and drop it in, now you can see the camera and the root. It had a glitch where it wasn't showing either of these two components, and I couldn't really move it around or anything, and you couldn't really see it in the scene. It's nothing major. If you ever run into an issue like this, go and close the project and reopen it. It will automatically, reload everything, so that way everything is showing properly. It will still work. It's just a bit of an annoyance. But I went ahead and added it in. So if we go and press play now, there we go. Oh, I forgot to set up player 0. So I went ahead and dragged in the player pawn. We need to set this up for auto possess player 0 and auto receive player input player 0. And now if we go and press play, you can see I'm in the right spot if my headset will work correctly. So yeah, there we go. One thing you will notice is the motion controllers are not yet hooked up, which we will go ahead and hook up right now. So if we go and escape, and we'll want to create a new C++ class for these. We'll go ahead, actor, and we'll call these VR motion controller. And go and create class. It will take a second. I'll be right back for that. Alright, so Unreal Engine finished adding our C++ class. So next thing we're going to want to do is I've gone ahead and opened up the header file. And there's going to be a couple things we want to add in here. First thing we're going to want to add is a root again. This isn't necessary, I don't believe. But again, I just find it nice to have just to make sure everything's working correctly. So we're going to want to make this visible anywhere. And we'll do class use scene component. And we'll call it root. Got the pointer. There we go. Go and clean that up. Next thing we're going to want to add is a motion controller component. This will actually be what is used to track our motion controllers as they're being moved around. And that's going to be U motion controller component. And we'll go and call it motion controller. Just keep it simple. We will need to add in an include file for that in a second, but I'll do that in a second here. Next thing we're going to want to add is, this isn't really necessary depending on what you're trying to achieve. So the motion controller component actually has a, I don't even remember what it's called, but it is possible to set up the motion controller so it will actually show whatever controller you're using. But if you don't want it to actually show, if you want it to look like more like a hand, you do need to add in a skeletal hand mesh, or not skeletal hand mesh, a skeletal mesh component, or a static mesh component. The difference being between these is, hold on, let me finish doing this real quick. We'll call it a hand mesh. A static mesh will not move. A skeletal mesh will. The skeletal mesh is actually what's used in the blueprint as well, since the hand actually has a skeleton and animations and everything. So yeah, next thing we're going to want to do is, actually first I'm going to add in the include files here, our libraries here. So first thing we're going to want to add is the motion controller component, I think is what it was called. Yep, component.h. And then we're also going to go ahead and add in for our skeletal mesh component / skeletal mesh component.h. And we'll go and add one in for the scene component as well. And there we go. We'll go and set up the root as we did in the pawn. So we'll go ahead and do root become equal create default sub object use scene components. And we'll go and set up attach. Oh no, it's set up root component, isn't it? Is it set? I think it is set up root component. Root. No, I was wrong. Set. Set root component. Next thing we're going to want to add is the motion controller, which is create default sub object motion controller component. Okay, so there. And then the skeletal mesh as well. So for the skeletal mesh, there is actually one that I forgot up here, and that is a constructor helper. Constructor helper is actually really nice. Core U object. I'm spelling this wrong. Core U object / public / U object / constructor helpers.h. Constructor helper is actually used to grab things from the content browser. So we're actually going to add in the path. So if we go into virtual reality mannequin character and then mesh, I believe is what it was. Yep. So right here's our skeletal mesh. So we're actually going to just copy that whole path over to the skeletal mesh, and that's what we're going to be setting for our hand mesh there. So if we actually go ahead, let's go and do that first. So we're going to make a static constructor helpers f object finder. We're going to want to get a use skeletal mesh. We'll call it scale mesh. Keep it nice and simple. And then this is where we're actually going to put the path to the skeletal mesh that we're using. So it's going to be game / virtual reality / mannequin / character / mesh / mannequin. It's called mannequin hand _ right. And there we go. And then we're going to actually assign this to our hand mesh. So let's go ahead. Hand mesh becomes equal to create default sub object view skeletal mesh component. And the hand mesh does need to actually be set, need to be attached to the motion controller. So this does need to be done. And then we're going to actually set its skeletal mesh. Set skeletal mesh. We're gonna want to get the scale mesh dot object, and you don't have to adjust the relative location, but I am going to here. The reason I'm doing this is the location seems slightly off to me on the skeletal mesh, so I'm just going to set it off just a little bit, so that way it seems just a little bit more accurate. Again, you don't need to do this. I just do it just because I think it needs a slight bit of adjustment. So that's that. Next thing we're going to want to do is we actually need to set up so our right hand and left hand can be set correctly. So that's actually going to require another variable here. So we're going to need to get a eController hand. And I'm actually going to make this public because we're actually going to modify this in the player pawn. So if we go ahead, we'll just go and call it hand. And this also requires another include file, which I had, which I have here. Let me see here. If I recall, it's this one. Include XR motion controller base, and I see I did not put that in the quotes. There we go. .h. There we go. So if we go ahead and do that, then next thing we're going to do is we're going to want to head down here to tick. Just because this may not be done automatically on begin play, I find that's just a little bit more reliable if you do it in tick. So we're going to do F attachment transform rules. We're going to create rules. And E attachment rule snap to target. E attachment rule snap to target. And our last one is actually going to be attachment rule keep world. So this is actually going to be used when we actually attach the motion controller here in a second. So if we go ahead, we grab our hand. So if it's an e-controller hand right, this will mean that it's our right hand, and I'm going to go and create another one for our left hand right here. E-controller hand left. Oh, hold on. I accidentally pressed the wrong one. There we go. Yeah. I have the right. Oh, I have one more than I need. Okay. Making sure that I have everything I need. So once we have this, first thing we're going to want to do is we're actually going to want to get the motion controller. Oh, shoot. Motion source. This will set which hand we're tracking. Controller base. Right hand source ID. So this will set us that way we'll actually track our right hand. And we'll have to do this for the left hand in a second as well. Next thing we're going to do is motion controller attach to component. This root component rules. And then not last one. We have one more thing we have to do after this. Set relative rotation. Rotation, and that's supposed to be a capital H right there. So we're going to want to set the relative rotation. So this is going to be determined based off of left and right hand, just because the rotations aren't quite right. So we're actually going to do F rotator 0.0 0, and the last one we're going to want to do is 90.0F. Just so we can set the rotation correctly, and just to make sure this doesn't get set again, we're also gonna change what hand is right here. I'll just set to any hand. And then all this is actually have to be done for the left hand. I'm actually just gonna go ahead and take this, copy this down, just to save a little bit of time. Rotation is correct. The one thing we do have to set though is the scale, just because the scale needs to be set differently for the left hand. Set relative scale 3D F vector .0F negative 1.0F. This will just invert it so that way it looks proper like a left hand. And then that should be all good on the pawn side. We actually have to jump back over into our player pawn real quick. So there's actually be a couple things we need to do. So first let's go and jump into the header. So visible, I'm spelling that right, anywhere. And we're actually going to do AVR motion controller left controller, and then we're also going to want one for the right controller as well. There we go. So that's all of that. Next we're going to want to jump into here, and actually first we want to make our include for the motion controller. So we need motion controller.h. If you're unsure, this will actually just be whatever name you assigned your motion controllers. So if you did name it motion controller, it might be called whatever you named it. So once we have that all done, we actually want to go down here to begin play. And we're actually going to want to set up the controllers, and we're going to want to also attach them as well. So first we need to set up some transform rules. Transform rules. Attachment. Snap to target. Next one is also going to be snap to target. Oh. Attachment rule. And this one we're actually going to keep world. Did I mess something up here? No instance. Oh, am I missing something? Oh, I did miss something. Hold on. Oh, I did miss something right here. So I'm actually going to go and jump back over here. That means I actually messed this up as well. There we go. I did not realize I had 4 parameters. I thought that I had 3. Anyways, next thing we're going to do is we'll set the left controller first. And we're actually going to have to first spawn an actor. Spawn actor. and this will be AVR motion controller. We're going to need to set its owner to the pawn, which is this. We're going to want to attach it then to the root component of this of this pawn, and it'll be attached under rules. And then the final thing we're going to want to do is left controller. We'll want to set hand equal to E controller and left. And then we're going to want to do basically all this for the right hand as well. The only thing we need to change, I believe, is this right here. There we go. And there we go. That should be everything set up. So we're going to go and compile, and be back in a sec once this is done. Alright, so finished compiling. I do want to note I ran into a couple minor issues. I didn't realize I left a semicolon here, just in case you're following, exactly along. You do also have to make sure that these are pointers, and I didn't realize I didn't finish my my full code here. This was supposed to be attached to component, not attach. So just to be sure of that there. So yeah, so if we go and press play here, once my headset goes, you can actually see now we have our hands are tracking. My headset is glitching out on me because my Guardian got lost, of course. Hold on. Alright, so there we go. I had to fix up that little issue there with the headset. But you can actually see we got hands moving around, heads moving. We can look all around. Of course, there's not much else we can do at the moment, just because nothing else has been set up. But I will be going over that in the future. So if you'd like to see that, please like, subscribe. And until next time.